Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And today's topic, as you can see, is the Vietnam era. Now, before we begin, as always, take a moment, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline to your right, and pay particular attention to those key terms at your left. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, why, be able to connect them to each other, and of course, their larger historical significance. You got it? Let's get started. So, the backdrop to all this so-called radicalism during the second half of 1960s was a raging Cold War at its hottest flashpoint, the Vietnam War. Now remember, while it is JFK who is going to first put troops on the ground in Vietnam, it was dramatically escalated by Lyndon Baines Johnson, which completely will end up derailing his domestic Great Society agenda. So let's talk about the war for a moment and then the U.S. home front response to it. So the real escalation of Vietnam begins after August 2nd, 1964, with what is called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And so on August 2nd, 1964, there was a minor skirmish involving 3 North Vietnamese ships and an American destroyer that occurred in the, Gulf of Tonkin. You see pictured on the screen. Now, 2 days later, on August 4th, there was an alleged second attack by the North Vietnamese Navy. Now, the thing about the second attack is that while the first attack, everyone agrees on the details, the second attack, the details are more murky. The veracity of the attack is still questionable. And so this second attack of firing on a U.S. ship, Hanoi, the capital of North Vietnam, denies and insisted it did not launch an attack. Which, on the one hand, you could say, well, they're trying to cover their butts to avoid retaliation. But on the other hand, why lie? Nonetheless, LBJ is going to order retaliatory airstrikes on the bases of the North Vietnamese torpedo boats. Then LBJ addressed the American people, indicating that the North Vietnamese and their leader, Ho Chi Minh, was the aggressor. As a result of this speech, Congress is going to pass what is called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolutions. And basically it gives LBJ the power to conduct military operations in Southeast Asia without congressional approval. Remember, an act of war in the United States, our Constitution, requires congressional approval for any action. The president cannot act unilaterally. And in this case, Congress abdicated that role and gave it fully to LBJ. And without having congressional approval, it essentially gives LBJ a blank check and carte blanche to, in the words of the resolution, to take all necessary steps, including the use of armed force, to assist any state requesting assistance in defense of its freedom. This isn't even just limited to South Vietnam. This is anything in the region that LBJ feels is important. He can basically do what he wants. Now, LBJ believes this is good. Congress agreed with it because Johnson believed that to not prevail in Vietnam would give communism an upper hand in Southeast Asia. Remember, it's already in China. It's already in North Vietnam. And if you let the South Vietnamese fall to communism, it'll create a domino effect across the region. And so with this new power given to LBJ, within a year, by fall of 1965, there are now more than 165,000 ground troops in South Vietnam. You can see the graph on the screen. After the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, late 1964, we see rapid escalation of ground troops. By 1968, just 3 years later, at the height of the Vietnam War, America had over 500,000, 550,000 troops in Vietnam. In addition, between the years 1965 and 1967, the United States is going to drop more bombs on Vietnam than all of the Allies during World War II combined. The sad part was, this is a very small region compared to Europe, but this was not an effective strategy here, because the type of war that was being fought in Vietnam was vastly different than World War II. This was being fought as guerrilla warfare, and just wholesale carpet bombing was not working. And in doing so, the goal of establishing a credible government in South Vietnam that was loyal to the United States was constantly being undermined by U.S. actions, by the U.S. military, not only the indiscriminate bombings, but the killing of Vietnamese civilians by the thousands, leading to a great deal of resentment that manifested itself both in Vietnam and back in the United States. Now, in addition, this war is expensive. It is estimated the Vietnam War cost American taxpayers $150 billion with a B. It was a quagmire that Johnson knew was a disaster, but felt he just couldn't pull out. Entering the presidency, he hoped to be the greatest president in history, focusing on domestic policy. But that domestic policy of the Great Society will increasingly be constrained by his efforts in the Vietnam War, and it will ultimately be the end of him. And so as the U.S. involvement begins to increase in Vietnam, the government began to re-implement the draft in the form of a lottery just to get enough warm bodies for the war effort. As the war raged on, as more and more young U.S. American bodies coming back in flag-draped caskets, it became more and more unpopular. Like, we understood, the United States understood, the American people understood World War II. We were bombed. That made sense. But for most Americans, fighting in Southeast Asia on behalf of people who weren't fully even committed to democracy seemed a bigger stretch. Throughout the course of the war, more than 58,000 Americans are going to die. Another 300,000 wounded. And the draft, had been in effect since World War II in the 50s and 60s, but it was ramped up as Vietnam heated up. Nearly 3.5 million men will serve during Vietnam. The vast majority, 2.2 million, are drafted. And many of those who were not drafted would volunteer just to avoid being drafted. This includes people like my own dad. It would fuel a rigorous anti-war movement, especially among the youth, especially those who were involved in what was called the New Left, those who are advocating for more liberalism, more civil rights, more equality, those who are taking part in the more radical elements that we talked about last time, whether it's the Chicano movement or the Black Power movement. But even Anglo-Americans were also taking part in these radical protests, these radical movements, but on their own accord, within more white-dominated groups. Thousands of young men refused to obey draft notices. Many were sent to prison. Some fled to Canada. Estimated that 550,000 Americans dodged the draft. And in the spring of 1967, 500,000 war protesters showed up in New York Central Park, ceremoniously burning their draft cards, all the time shouting, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids you killed today?" And this use of heavy conscription resulted in widespread protests across the country. And by 1967, the protest movement had grown quite strong. Protests against American involvement, protests against LBJ personally, protests against Dow Industrial Chemicals, who were making the napalm that was being dropped in Vietnam and killing so many innocents. And while Anglo-Americans protest en masse, the Black Power movement, African Americans protest en masse, because when draftees who are being drafted for the war are seeking deferments, one of the major deferments for young people is being enrolled in college. Well, statistically speaking, especially by 1967, 68, the vast majority of those in college are Anglo-Americans, people of color, especially African Americans and Mexican Americans. They are not able to get deferments. Number one, because they're not enrolled in college, statistically speaking, in any significant number compared to Anglos. And B, because of the racist attitude of draft boards. In one of the interviews I listened to for my research, he recalled saying he was in college. This is a Chicano man. He was in college. He tried to get a deferment and was told no. He probably should have pressed further and gotten the deferment. But he figured, why bother? The draft boards that hear these hearings or these cases, when you seek a deferment, they didn't care. All they saw was a brown-skinned person. And as a result of this, there would be a strong Chicano and Chicana anti-war movement that became an expression of the larger anti-war movement. Especially when one of the pilots who was shot down in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964 was Everett Alvarez. And this hit home for a lot of the Chicano community. And they began to organize the Chicano Moratorium Committee against the Vietnam War. This was a movement of the period that saw the war as yet another manifestation of American imperialism. In other words, many Americans believed, again, whether white, black, or brown, they believed that America was not in Vietnam solely because it was about preserving democracy or stopping communism, but rather as a way to exploit another group of people and colonize a new region. The way we had the American Southwest, the way we had Puerto Rico, the way we had the Philippines. And they see this war. Again, this is not just Chicanos. This is African Americans. This is Anglos who are part of the New Left movement. They see this war as just another manifestation of American imperialism, another branch of even manifest destiny. And the goal of the Chicano Moratorium was to end military action by the United States in Vietnam, to create a change in U.S. foreign policy toward nations that are predominantly people of color. And, of course, the liberation of Chicanos within the United States. They demanded that Chicanos fight at home for equality rather than far away in a strange place. Why are they being sent over to die in a foreign land when they're facing discrimination here at home? And the Mexican American Youth Organization, MAYO, the Political Association for Spanish-Speaking Organizations, PASO, and the Brown Berets all began to organize and protest the war. Why? This is a continuation of a tragic living experience. They're living in neighborhoods with aging infrastructure, plummeting property values, and increasing abject poverty. They were still victims of segregationist laws, systemic disenfranchisement, over-policing, mass incarcerations. And when the war began, they then became steady cannon fodder, disposable troops, who to a large number of Anglo-American leadership didn't seem to care if they lived or died. This was being seen as using the Chicanos to fight a white man's struggle. Again, this is not, again, I say this as a Mexican American study course, yes. This is not just Chicanos, this is African Americans, this is other Anglo New Left young people. And while the official position of the American government for its involvement in Vietnam was to prevent the nation from becoming communist, for Chicanos, it was nothing more than an illegal war that manipulated young men and used them as pawns to fulfill the US's imperialistic desires. They began to see the draft as a devil's draft, which aggressively came after Chicanos, especially those who were not enrolled in colleges or places of higher learning or with steady employment. Remember, deferments. You can apply for a deferment if you're drafted. Many did. But especially for African Americans and Chicanos, those applications were steadily denied, as draft boards were typically staffed by older, conservative, Anglo men who were unaware of the issues that plagued Chicanos and made them more susceptible to draft orders in the first place. This all came to a head in San Francisco on Thanksgiving Day, 1967. Oh, there was a parade that day through the streets of San Francisco, but didn't feature the blow-up balloons of Snoopy or Charlie Brown or Santa Claus. No. This was the Chicano Moratorium, who began to launch the first ever Chicano anti-war march to boycott the war, to boycott the draft, to draw attention to the plights of Chicanos across the country who were being sent by the thousands to be slaughtered. That was 67. 1968, things only get worse. Now, on the one hand, historians are fascinated by the year 1968. It is a year that is seemingly like no other. So many crucial events happen. This is considered a turning point year for Vietnam, for civil rights, for liberalism. This is a year that, as the Time magazine article says, that shaped a generation, but also shaped a nation. This is the year that changes almost everything. There's a lot of big events. And again, you could spend an entire semester on 1968 alone. I'm going to give you a couple of highlights and then go into detail on a couple of the more important ones to this course. First and foremost, it was the first televised interracial kiss that occurred on the sci-fi television show Star Trek, when Captain Kirk will kiss Lieutenant Uhura. And Kirk's very famous line, what he says in the episode was, "Where I come from, size, shape, or color makes no difference." Well, obviously in the real world United States, all those things did make a difference, especially color. But here was Star Trek, a sci-fi show, being quite progressive, quite liberal. And theoretically, because the show takes place in the future, where he's from, the United States, had hopefully gotten past that point. Now, it was said very interestingly that this shot, the kiss, they filmed it multiple times. You know, like most television shows, you film a scene multiple times and take the best take to put into the episode. It was said, though, that both William Shatner and Uhura there were so afraid that the network would chicken out of actually airing the kiss, basically giving in to pressure from white supremacist groups, that the only take that was usable was the one where they actually kissed. That other renditions of the scene, they purposely messed the scene up just to ensure that that kiss would be shown on screen. Also, 1968, it was an Olympic year. The Summer Olympics were held in Mexico City. And Black U.S. Olympians on the medal stand for track and field, during the national anthem, would give a protest, the Black Power salute. And you can read my screen right now. It says that why they did this. And Tommy Smith and John Carlos here says he wore a black scarf to represent Black pride. Said the black socks and no shoes symbolized Black poverty. He wore beads for the individuals who had been lynched or killed, with no prayers, no justice. But the rest of the story is this is a very popular and very famous photo in history. Them protesting during the Olympics to draw attention to the issues facing the Black and brown communities in the United States. But 2 days later, they were expelled from Team USA. But they returned to their communities as heroes. 1968 also featured the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., with a wave of riots across the nation. It featured the assassination of presidential frontrunner Bobby Kennedy, JFK's younger brother, former Attorney General. But those aren't even the most important events that are directly pertaining to this class. The year started with what was called the Tet Offensive. And the Tet Offensive that took place on January 31st, 1968, was a turning point for the Vietnam War. You see, on January 31st, 1968, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese military would launch an all-out offensive on key American and South Vietnamese positions within South Vietnam. So attacking military bases. The offensive caught the U.S. off guard. They were surprised by this attack because there had been a 2-day ceasefire called to celebrate the Tet holidays, the first day of the new year on the traditional lunar calendar, and one of the most important Vietnamese holidays. In addition, as you see on the map, the North Vietnamese attacked by going through Laos and Cambodia, using these so-called neutral countries as a place to launch their attacks. So the offensive began on the early morning, January 31st, as more than 80,000 communist troops would strike against American positions. The purpose was to strike military and civilian command centers, to spark a general uprising among the South Vietnamese, and to overthrow the U.S. loyal South Vietnamese government. Essentially try to end the Vietnam War in one blow. It would leave at least 2,000 servicemen dead and 1,000 more Vietnamese dead. Now, the attack, it took the American troops by surprise. Many died. But the Americans would quickly contain most of the attacks. And the North Vietnamese will also suffer a great deal of losses during the Tet Offensive. In fact, looking at sheer numbers, the Tet Offensive was actually a massive failure for the North Vietnamese. It was actually an American victory. But numbers don't tell the whole story. Because the Tet Offensive had a devastating impact on American perception. You see, the American government under Lyndon Baines Johnson had been insisting that the war was close to being won, close to being over. But yet the Tet Offensive made the American public question the veracity of the government statements. Like, how can the North launch a successful attack, surprise attack, if the United States has been winning this whole time? Like, if they're almost in defeat and ready to surrender, how do you make this work? How do you bring it together? And it represented what was called the credibility gap. The gap between what the American public expected and what was really going on in Vietnam. And what this Tet Offensive reflected was what the war protesters had been saying for years, that the American government was lying to the American public. It was a definite turning point, the Tet Offensive was, because it officially turned the vast majority of the American public against the war in Vietnam. Up until the Tet Offensive, statistically speaking, the majority of Americans supported the war effort as a patriotic cause. They believed the U.S. president when he said, "We're here to fight for democracy." But after Tet, all across the country, Americans, especially the youth, began to protest all the more vehemently, including ramped up protests by the Chicano Moratorium. They began to make the case that the Vietnamese, like the Chicanos, were people of color who were being subjected to military oppression by an aggressive and imperialistic-minded American government. Chicanos came to see the Vietnamese and their conditions overseas as similar to their own. A colored, working class people being invaded and oppressed by a military superpower hell-bent on their destruction, who only saw them as pawns or exploited laborers. This would give rise to a multiracial group known as the Third World Liberation Front, established by Chicanos, African Americans, Asians, and others, who demanded that more classes be taught their history and their culture to be offered at colleges and universities, to put an end to the war and to teach a more multicultural history. Now, after the Tet Offensive, the protests ramp up. American public opinion is decidedly against LBJ and the war. More and more ethnic minority groups are coming together to fight against this travesty. And LBJ decides to not run for re-election. And the Democrats would immediately turn to Bobby Kennedy. Remember, 1960 is an election year. And the Democratic Party turns to Bobby Kennedy. But while he's campaigning in California in the primary season, he's assassinated. And then, despite not being part of the primaries, the Democratic Party instead turned to Johnson's VP, Hubert Humphrey, whom the youth loathed as representing the escalation of Vietnam. A riot will break out in Chicago after he was announced as their candidate. Meanwhile, Republicans lined up behind Richard Nixon, who's back after an 8-year absence after his loss to JFK back in 1960. Now, throughout the election, Nixon would capitalize on the American frustration at the violence and urban unrest of the 60s. He promised stability. He appealed to many Americans that Nixon referred to as the silent majority. According to Nixon, there was a silent majority of Americans. And when I say that, I mean Anglo, white, middle-class Americans, who in the mind of Nixon were just fed up with all the protesters, fed up with the violence, fed up with the riots, fed up with the civil disorder that took place within American society, fed up with the rebellious youth and their permissiveness, fed up with civil rights protests, fed up with welfare benefiting supposedly those who did not work. In other words, Nixon is courting that middle America who, in his words, they just want to get up, go to work, support their families, and come home and enjoy their middle-class suburban life. He's appealing to that group of Americans. And in his mind, that group of Americans is fed up with all the protests, all the violence, all the agitation for civil rights, all the attack on what was perceived as, well, the good old days of the 1950s. Which, if you recall, Nixon was the vice president during most of the 1950s, from 1952 to 1960. And so when the U.S. public looked at these two candidates, Hubert Humphrey, the vice president for most of the 1960s, the escalation of Vietnam, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, but also the race riots, the Chicano movement, the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, Malcolm X, the Vietnam War. And so when America looked at these two candidates, one represented the good old days of the 1950s, conformity, whereas Humphrey, the Democratic candidate, seemed very much like the 60s, turbulent, radical, the Vietnam War. And to the silent majority, Nixon promised stability. He promised law and order politics. Those are his words. An end to the chaos, and promised a return to peace and prosperity of the 1950s. Nixon would travel the country over promising to end Vietnam, promising peace with honor, promising to end the racial violence, not by giving or actually creating equality for what the minority groups were protesting for, but just to end it with law and order. And yet, given all this, he will easily win in 1968. Now, we're going to stop here. When we come back, we'll talk about the end of Vietnam and just how much that impacted the Mexican American community. So until then, take care and bye-bye.